Alright, you already know a little bit about the cell membrane. Cell transport happens through the cell membrane because the job of the cell membrane is to move things in and out of the cells. The cell membrane is said to have selective permeability, and that just means that only certain things can pass through the cell membrane. It's selective because not everything can pass through, and it's permeable because some things can pass through. This is a picture of the cell membrane. It should look familiar to you. We've got two layers of lipids with the red glycerol heads and the yellow fatty acid tails. This is what the cell membrane looks like. This is a three-dimensional version of the same picture, but notice that in this picture we don't just have lipids, we also have some proteins. In this picture we have purple and red and green proteins, and these proteins make a door through the membrane for large molecules to pass through. There are two ways that things can pass through the membrane. They can either pass through by passive transport or by active transport. We're first going to look at passive transport. Passive transport does not require any energy, and it's kind of like pushing a wheelbarrow downhill. It just sort of rolls on its own, and it doesn't require any energy from you. You don't have to push very hard. So it's sort of like moving downhill. Now, the hill that we're talking about is not a physical hill where you have a high point and a low point. It's more of a hill in terms of concentration. We're moving from a high concentration, so there's a lot of something in a small area, to a low concentration where there's a little bit of something in an area. The first kind of passive transport is osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules across a membrane, and there are three kinds of osmosis. There is osmosis in an isotonic solution. In an isotonic solution, you have an equal amount of solute and minerals inside the cell as you have outside of the cell. So if we were using salt as an example, the green dots in the picture of the isotonic solution could represent salt. So we have an equal amount of salt inside the cell as we have outside of the cell. When this is the case, you have water movement in and out of the cell. So the water is never going to just stay where it is. It's always going to be moving, and so you have an equal amount of water moving in and out, and that's keeping the concentrations equal. The second kind of osmosis is a hypertonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, you have more solute on the outside of the cell than you have on the inside. So you have a high concentration of particles outside of the cell and a low concentration of particles inside the cell. And if this is the case, the water inside the cell is going to move out of the cell to dilute the surrounding area. So if these green dots are salt, then you have a very salty solution that the cell is sitting in, and the cell is going to want to dilute the saltiness of the area around it, and so it's going to move water out of the cell to dilute the saltiness. And if you move water out of the cell, it's going to cause the cell to contract, and if it shrinks too much, the cell can die. So hypertonic solutions can be very dangerous for cells. The last kind of osmosis is osmosis in a hypotonic solution. Hypotonic solutions have very little solute on the outside of the cell and more solute on the inside of the cell. So we have a high concentration of salt inside the cell and a low concentration on the outside. And if this is the case, the cell is going to do the opposite as it did in the hypertonic situation. It's going to move water from the outside of the cell into the cell to dilute the saltiness on the inside. And when the cell moves water into itself, it's going to begin to expand. And if the cell expands too much, it's going to burst, and this can be very dangerous for a cell as well. So the isotonic solution is the healthiest condition for a cell to survive in. There are two other kinds of passive transport. So far we've talked about osmosis, where you move water molecules, but there is also diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of particles across a membrane. And here we're talking about particles, so that's things like salt or sugar or starch, things that are not water. The last kind of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. And facilitated diffusion is the movement of particles across a membrane by using a channel protein. And this is going to be for molecules that are very large, things like starch or protein. These particles can't move through the membrane without having some kind of door to go through. And so this is facilitated diffusion because you have a protein channel that's facilitating the movement of these particles into the cell. These are the three kinds of passive transport. Now let's look at the active transport. Active transport requires energy from the cell. So if passive transport is moving downhill, active transport is like moving uphill. Like pushing a cart uphill requires energy, so does active transport. This is the movement from a low concentration to a high concentration. So you're moving against the concentration gradient. There are two kinds of active transport. We have exocytosis, which is just what it sounds like. It is something exiting the cell. So the cell is going to move waste out of it through the membrane, and it's going to move out through a protein channel. And the other kind of active transport is endocytosis. Endocytosis is where the cell moves something into it, and it also has to move through a protein channel. There are two kinds of endocytosis depending on what it is that the cell is moving inside of it. The pinocytosis is when the cell moves a liquid into its membrane, so it's like the cell is drinking, and phagocytosis is when the cell moves something solid into the membrane, so it's like the cell is eating. Phagocytosis is what your white blood cells do when they consume a bacteria to break it down.